Robert Blackwood watched the city of Chicago from his office on the 40th floor. 58 years old, perfectly trimmed gray hair, a custom-made Italian suit. He was the embodiment of the American dream. His industries employed thousands of people, and his name was among the most influential in the country. But on that autumn afternoon, his expression revealed growing irritation as he waited for his son's arrival. The door opened, and Matthew, his only son, walked in. Tall like his father, but with a more delicate build, his gentle eyes contrasted with the harshness of his father's gaze. "You called for me, Dad?" Robert turned his chair and stared at his son. "Your mother told me you missed the investor meeting yesterday because you were at that church again. Is that true?" Matthew took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, Dad. There was a spiritual retreat I couldn't miss." Robert slammed his hand on the desk. "Couldn't miss? In the future of Blackwood Industries, can you afford to miss that? I have 2 daughters who chose careers that have nothing to do with business. You are my only son, Matthew. My heir." "Dad, we need to talk about this. There's something I need to tell you." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized that tone. "Say it." "I'm joining the seminary next month. I feel called, Dad. Since I was a child, I've felt God calling me to serve Him." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shout. Robert slowly stood up, looking at his son as if he were a stranger. "You're going to throw away your education, your future, your family's legacy, to become a priest? A man who earns next to nothing to comfort people he doesn't even know?" "It's not about money, Dad." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it's not about money for you, because you've never had to worry about it. Do you know why? Because I worried about it. I built an empire from nothing while your mother filled your head with these fairy tales about Jesus and saints." Robert walked toward the window, gazing at the city he considered his kingdom. "God? What God, Matthew? Have you ever seen a miracle happen? Have you ever seen God sign $1 million contract or solve a financial crisis? I built all of this with my own hands, not with prayers. Dad, please, no. Listen carefully to what I'm about to say. If you walk out that door to become a priest, you are no longer my son. You will not get a single cent from me, nor a place in this family. Choose God or your family." Matthew had tears in his eyes, but his voice was steady. "I love you, Dad, and I love my sisters and my mother, but I can't ignore my calling. Then go. And don't come back." Matthew took one last look at his father and left. Robert didn't turn to watch him go. He remained, still, staring at his empire, feeling something break inside his chest, something he couldn't or perhaps wouldn't identify. 7 years had passed since that autumn afternoon. Robert was now 65 but looked 80. The wrinkles on his face had deepened, and his hair was nearly completely white. He hadn't seen or spoken to Matthew since then. At home, he rarely saw his wife, Margaret. His daughters Elizabeth and Catherine worked in his companies, but their relationship was purely professional. Elizabeth, with a degree in business administration, handled the finances, while Catherine, with her MBA, managed public relations. Both were competent. Robert knew that, but he never admitted it. "Mr. Blackwood, the reports for the last quarter are ready," Elizabeth said, stepping into his office on a Monday morning. Robert barely looked up. "Leave them on my desk." "Dad, you don't look well. You should get some rest." "Don't call me Dad at the office, Elizabeth. And I'm perfectly fine. The company won't run itself." Elizabeth sighed. "Our stocks have risen 12% since I implemented the new financial strategy. Catherine secured 3 new international contracts last month. We could take on more responsibilities. If you let us." Robert finally looked at his daughter. "You're women, Elizabeth. This is a man's world. It always has been." Elizabeth shook her head in disbelief. "It's 2025 and you still think like that. That's why Matt left. You never saw beyond your own convictions." "Don't mention that name in this office," Robert growled. "Your brother chose to abandon his family for superstitions." "He didn't abandon anyone. You pushed him away." Robert felt a sharp pain in his chest but ignored it. He was used to ignoring pain, both physical and emotional. "Get back to work, Elizabeth." When she left, Robert opened his desk drawer and took out his blood pressure medication. Lately, he had been taking increasingly higher doses. His doctor had warned him about the risks of a heart attack if he kept up this pace, but Robert had scoffed. "My heart is as strong as my company, doctor." That night, he worked late as usual. The building was nearly empty when he finally shut down his computer. In the elevator, he felt slightly dizzy but blamed it on exhaustion. In the parking lot, as he walked to his car, the pain in his chest returned, this time much more intense. Robert tried to steady himself against a pillar, but his legs gave out. The pain was unbearable now, radiating down his left arm. His last conscious thought was that he would die alone, in an empty parking lot, far from everyone he had ever loved, and perhaps never truly loved the right way. "Mr. Blackwood, can you hear me?" Robert slowly opened his eyes. Fluorescent lights, white walls, the steady beeping of monitors. He was in a hospital. A nurse was adjusting the IV beside his bed. "You had a heart attack, sir. Fortunately, a security guard in the parking lot found you in time and called an ambulance." Robert tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Your family was notified. Your wife and daughters are outside." Family. The word felt strange, almost foreign. When was the last time he had truly been with his family? Not just in the same physical space, but truly present? Margaret entered first, followed by Elizabeth and Catherine. Their faces showed concern, but also a distance, one he himself had created over the years. "Bobby," Margaret said, using the nickname she hadn't spoken in years. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone who almost died," he answered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The doctor said you need to completely change your lifestyle," Catherine said. "No more working 18-hour days, no more constant stress." Robert closed his eyes for a moment. The company will survive," Elizabeth interrupted. "We'll take care of it. It's time for you to take care of yourself." For the first time in a long time, Robert truly looked at his daughters. He saw Elizabeth's determination, the intelligence in Catherine's eyes. When had they become these strong women standing before him? How had he not noticed? I'll get better soon," he said, but without his usual conviction. The days in the hospital dragged on. Robert, used to controlling everything, now found himself at the mercy of doctors and nurses. His phone and laptop had been confiscated by Margaret. Initial protests quickly turned into resignation when the cardiologist made it clear, "Either you change your lifestyle, or you won't be here next year." One afternoon, feeling suffocated, within the four walls of his room, Robert decided to take a walk down the corridor, leaning on his IV stand. The doctors had recommended short walks for his recovery. As he passed a room with the door slightly ajar, a voice made him stop. A voice he hadn't heard in 7 years but would recognize anywhere. His already fragile heart pounded in his chest. He stepped closer to the door and peeked inside. An elderly man lay in the hospital bed, clearly in his final moments. Around him, his family wept silently. And standing beside the bed, his back to the door, was a young man wearing a clerical gloire. Father Matthew Blackwood held the dying man's hand, praying softly but audibly. "God of infinite mercy, receive your son as he returns home. Forgive his faults as he forgave those who wronged him." The elderly man, his voice weak, spoke. "I wasted so much time on things that didn't matter. My family, my children. I lost precious moments." "It is never too late for love, Mr. Miller," Matthew responded gently. "Your family is here now. Tell them what you need to say." The dying man looked at each face gathered around his bed. "Forgive me for not being present, for valuing work more than you, for being too proud to admit my mistakes." A woman, likely his wife, squeezed his hand through her tears. "We forgive you, John. We love you." "I'm afraid, Father," the man confessed. "Do not be afraid," Matthew reassured him. "You are not alone on this journey. Your family is here, and God is waiting to receive you with open arms." Robert watched the scene, frozen. The dying man's words echoed in his mind as if they were meant. For him, he felt tears. How long had it been since he cried, sliding down his face? At that moment, as if sensing his presence, Matthew turned slightly and saw his father at the door. Their eyes met for a brief moment, but Matthew didn't interrupt his ministry. He continued comforting the man and his family until peacefully Mr. Miller passed away. Robert quickly retreated, returning to his room before Matthew stepped out. He lay on his bed, trembling, not from physical weakness, but from an overwhelming emotion he couldn't control. The next morning, Robert asked Margaret to find Matthew and invite him to visit. She looked surprised, but pleased. "He comes here regularly as a chaplain, Bobby. Did you know he has been serving at this hospital for 3 years?" Robert shook his. There was so much he didn't know about his son's life. Matthew arrived in the late afternoon. He was older, of course, but there was a serenity in him that Robert had never seen in anyone. "Hi, Dad," he said simply, standing in the doorway. "Matt, please come in." Matthew sat in the chair beside the bed. An awkward silence filled the room until Robert finally broke it. "I saw you yesterday, with that man and his family." Matthew nodded. "Mr. Miller, a good man who lived with the same priorities as many of us: work, status, money. In the end, like everyone, he realized what truly mattered. Like me," Robert said quietly. "Dad." "No, Matt. Let me speak, please. I've spent 7 years without saying what needed to be said." Robert took a deep breath, preparing for the hardest words he had ever spoken. "I was wrong. About everything, about you, your sisters, your mother, about what really matters in life. I mocked your faith, your calling. I ridiculed what gives meaning to your life. And why? Out of pride. Out of a distorted vision of success." Tears streamed down Robert's face. "I built an empire, but I lost my family in the process. I almost died alone in a parking lot, Matt. Alone. Is that how a successful man's story ends? Is this the legacy I've built?" Matthew took his father's hand. "It's not too late, Dad. It's never too late as long as we're alive. Can I ask you something, son? How did you endure it? How did you not hate me after everything I said and did?" Matthew smiled softly. "It wasn't easy. There were days of anger, of pain. But the faith you mocked is the same faith that taught me to forgive. That showed me love is stronger than pride. And God? Does he forgive a stubborn old man like me? That's the most beautiful thing about faith, Dad. God doesn't love us because of our merits, but despite our flaws." Robert remained silent for a moment, absorbing his son's words. "I want to know this God, Matt. I want to understand what makes your eyes shine when you talk about him. I want to understand what called you so strongly that you left everything to follow him." "I didn't leave everything, Dad. I just chose a different path. And that path brought me back to you today." The following week, before being discharged, Robert requested a family meeting in his hospital room. Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Matthew were all present. For the first time in years, the Blackwoods were together. "I want to ask for forgiveness from each of you," Robert began. "Margaret, my wife, forgive me for being an absent husband, for putting business above our marriage." He turned to his daughters. "Elizabeth, Catherine, forgive me for not recognizing your abilities, for being blind to the extraordinary women you have become. Starting today, if you accept, you two will officially take over as presidents of Blackwood Industries." The sisters exchanged surprised glances. "And Matt, my son, forgive me for trying to force you to be who I wanted, not who you were called to be. I mocked what gives meaning to your life. But yesterday, watching you comfort that family, I understood something. While I built factories, you build hope. While I accumulated wealth, you offer consolation. While I commanded employees, you take care of the most precious thing people have, their souls." "Dad," Catherine interrupted, emotional. "What caused this change?" Robert gave a sad smile. "Heart attack has a peculiar way of putting things into perspective. But it wasn't just that. It was seeing your brother yesterday, being exactly who he was born to be, and realizing that I almost lost all of you because of my pride." Robert extended his hands, and everyone moved closer, forming a circle around the bed. "Matt, would you mind saying a prayer for this family that is trying to rebuild itself?" Matthew, with tears in his eyes, nodded and began to pray, while Robert, for the first time in decades, bowed his head in humility. 2 months later, the changes in Robert Blackwood's life surprised everyone who knew him. He now went to the office only 3 times a week, for just a few hours. Elizabeth and Catherine were running the empire he had built, with an efficiency that even the most skeptical had to acknowledge. On Sundays, to the astonishment of the local congregation, Robert and Margaret sat in the front pew of the church, where Matthew celebrated Mass. The powerful businessman, once known for his ruthlessness, was now seen distributing coats at homeless shelters and funding social programs across the city. One Sunday afternoon, after the service, as they walked through the park, Robert asked his son, "Matt, do you think it was fate that I had a heart attack in that particular hospital on those exact days when you were there?" Matthew smiled. "Some would call it coincidence. Others destiny. I prefer to call it grace." "How so?" "Grace is when we receive not what we deserve, but what we need. You needed a wake-up call, and it came in the form of a heart attack. You needed to see with your own eyes the work I do, and that happened with Mr. Miller. And I needed to forgive and be forgiven, and that happened when we found each other again." Robert stopped walking and looked up at the clear Chicago sky. "You know, Matt, I spent my life building, planning, controlling. I thought success was just an equation I could solve. But now I understand that life is so much bigger than our small ambitions, and that we are all part of something we cannot fully comprehend. That, Dad," Matthew smiled, "is the beginning of faith." "I still have a lot to learn," Robert admitted. "We all do, Dad. The journey of faith never ends." They walked in silence for a while, until Robert spoke again. "You know, what impresses me the most? It's not that God exists. It's that after everything I said and did, after all my arrogance and mockery, He still cared enough to give me a second chance. That is the greatest lesson of all, Dad. No matter how far we stray, the way back is always open." Robert Blackwood, the man who once mocked his son's faith, now walked beside him, not just physically but spiritually. His empire still stood, but now it served a purpose greater than the mere accumulation of wealth. And his family, once fractured by his pride, was now reunited through forgiveness and love. Values he finally understood were far more precious than all the material riches he had amassed. In his heart, he knew that the crisis that had nearly killed him had, paradoxically, given him true life. And that, he reflected silently, was the greatest miracle of all.